Angus Taylor has named his new frontbench, but that discussion can wait. We have a new lead, Tony, and it goes to the heart of the historic shift in the right of Australian politics. For months now that we, or at least certainly I did, we thought that the South Australian election in 4 weeks' time would be predictable, that Labor basically would win easily. In fact, they could even win close to the mark of Mark McGowan in Western Australia with that historic victory there. But what I mean by that, a two-way contest with one clear winner. But now a news poll tells us that that this could mean far more than that. It could have federal implications, and it just might be the first real-time election outcome that tells us the story that, or it certainly confirms the story of the decline of the Liberal Party and the realignment on the right. The poll I'm talking about is a news poll, South Australian election, state election. It has ALP on 44 primary vote, and we expected that, I guess. But the real kicker is One Nation on 24, and the Libs on just 14. Now, there's a second poll, a YouGov poll in the Adelaide Advertiser, which is a bit better than that for the Liberal Party, but it still has One Nation ahead of them, 22 to 20. It just seems to me that this tells you there's a whole new ball game around, that the Liberal Party is not now realistically fighting for government. What it's fighting to achieve is to remain the major party in opposition. Tony, if those polls are anywhere near accurate, if that is the outcome, what are the consequences?
I think they're accurate in terms of a snapshot in time. The real test will be, does it hold until the election? And of course in South Australia, that's in March. And does it translate into votes on the actual day? And of course, for that, you need to have campaign machinery, you need to have candidates and volunteers and fundraising. So there's a long way to go yet, but the only real test will be on that night. But I think we can pretty confidently say there's a major realignment happening on the centre-right at the moment, and a fragmentation of the major party vote. And the Liberal Party are fighting for its very survival right now.
And when you make that point about it holding up, of course, the experience in South Australia itself was with Nick Xenophon, whose party actually led the primary vote in polling leading up to an election. It didn't hold up under scrutiny. There was sort of a lack of policies, I suppose. And again, that's still to come. This is an opinion poll. People tend to use that as a protest vote at times. And so the One Nation has to survive the scrutiny that will now come on them in the same way that it comes onto the major parties. Their candidates will have to appeal at the local level, so there is a long way to go. But nevertheless, we haven't seen these kind of numbers before.
Yeah, and I think the real danger here is that One Nation vote, I suspect a lot of that is actually the voters wanting to empower One Nation to shake the whole system up. And we spoke recently about the poll that we did for the AFR, where we asked which of the following statements best aligns with your view of the political system right now. And we offered, minor change, major change, no real change, but burn it all down. 15% of all voters said burn it all down, but 35% of One Nation voters said that. And so I think, those outrageous comments that Pauline Hanson made the other night, I'm not convinced that's going to affect her numbers. I'm going to be looking at that very, very keenly over the next round of polls that we're about to release. I just sort of feel that there'll be a lot of voters out there who say, look, I don't agree with her. I think she went too far, but she is the vehicle I need to burn the show down.
Just to give some context on this, and for listeners and viewers right around Australia, that beyond South Australia, what has happened there in recent times is that the Marshall government was defeated at the last election after just one turn, and comprehensively defeated. There are 47 seats in the Assembly in South Australia. Labor got 27 seats and the Lib 16, and there were some independents, but 27 seats. And then they won a couple on top of that, which is unusual for a government to win seats from the opposition in by-elections. They achieved that on the back of a 55-45 two-party split. Now, before today, the polls were suggesting 61-39 in favour of the Labor Party, and that's what built this expectation that Labor was going to win big. I think the optimists after that poll in the Liberal Party would have thought, well, they can field a cricket team, and the realists were saying, well, maybe it'll be a netball team. But if that one nation vote holds up, it could be worse than that, because the most of what is left of the Liberal Party in South Australia is in the rural and regional seats, and that's where One Nation will be at its strongest.
Yeah, I think what we're looking at here is, and we've been talking about it's going to be an extinction level event even before the surge of One Nation, purely because Peter Malinauskas is just a political athlete. But the thing that did strike me is, as catastrophically bad as it is for the Liberal Party with their votes in the teens in most polls in South Australia, is that Peter Malinauskas 12 months ago was polling in the high 40s primary vote, which reflects his, performance levels as a political communicator and performer. But it's now come down to high 30s, maybe 40%. So I think some of that One Nation vote, whilst it's the great majority of it is coming off the Liberal pile, obviously, there seems to be a few points coming off the Labor pile. And I guess, the thing that Labor needs to be concerned about is, are there more votes to be lost to One Nation by people who are frustrated with the two-party system, which is something we're seeing in our focus groups. I wouldn't rule it out. I don't think it's going to necessarily happen, but I wouldn't rule out that they start eating into Labor territory soon.
Yeah, but it's hard to see where that happens in South Australia. You can see it happening in other areas, and Labor's certainly going to be vulnerable in some places. But if you were to get the kind of doomsday scenario result, would it start a conversation in this country about the vacuum that will then exist on the centre-right of Australian politics? Because it's not an area that Labor is seriously challenging. There are times when you think the Liberal Party has lost interest in that area. You've got the Teals capturing part of it, but they are a series of independents. They're not a party. Do you think it would start a conversation around that?
Yeah, I think, the Liberal Party's got a massive identity crisis right now. People don't know what they stand for. They know what they stand against, but they can't tell you what they stand for. That sort of better economic management legacy that they used to have is kind of very diminished now. In fact, Labor generally in most polls have a lead on that. And if there's, that was the reason to vote Liberal all throughout the Howard and Costello years. And so I think, without that to leverage off, I think, the Liberal Party's going to be in a lot of strife because, they're being very tactical and there's no sort of broader strategic messaging. Having said that, I think the reshuffle this week was very interesting. Tim Wilson, I think, is a good choice for Shadow Treasurer. He's a good communicator. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in quite a bit more detail, but just finally on the South Australian situation. Look, I've learned the lesson over many years that you don't put too much weight on state election polls or state election results in terms of federal implications. But what is new about this is that this will be the first test of whether the surge for One Nation in the polls is going to transfer to votes on election day. I think that's what now makes South Australia fascinating for the whole country. But whatever happens, there will be another chance, like for the Liberal Party to say, well, let's just accept we've hit rock bottom. Now we've got to look at Victoria, and that's where we've got to put in our efforts, because in late November this year, they will get a second chance, and you would think they'd have a shot at it. The danger now is that One Nation could replicate these kind of numbers in Victoria, and then that would disturb what is a genuine prospects on the part of the coalition of Victoria.
Yeah, I think if South Australia is a total annihilation for the Liberal Party, then compounded with a really poor or modest result in November on what is already a 12-year-old government that, let's face it, has got more than its fair share of problems, and now it's got corruption sort of allegations with CFMEU and so forth. If the coalition can't make up major ground and win, I think that's going to be a seminal moment for the Liberal Party where, the panic will go all the way through to Canberra because, it is ripe for the taking. There is 16 seats. That's a lot of ground to make up. But the preconditions are there for a big result. We're in the field right now for Victorian State, and we should have those results out soon. But I think we're going to see similar voting behaviours and patterns as we're seeing all around the country at the moment, which is a surge in support for One Nation as a form of protest and empowerment to shake the whole system up. Interestingly, though, there was a Resolve poll in Queensland out this week as well, got less publicity, but the LNP government isn't being hugely bothered by the One Nation vote, but I think that's due to performance levels of Crisafulli and general perception that they seem to be focused on the bread and butter issues. They're not really distracted by some of those cultural issues or fringe issues that the Federal Liberal Party is. But I think what we're looking at here, Barry, is some of these results in all the polling for the coalition, not just in Canberra. It's not just a Susan Ley thing. It's a Liberal Party thing. And it's a reminder that if you play on the political fringes, you start getting fringe political results.
Yeah, that's a powerful point to make. I do look forward to the Redbridge poll because there has been some significant variance in the polls that we've seen so far in Victoria. One of them, I think, with the Resolve poll, had the two major parties at 28 and 30, so sort of toe-to-toe. And then the Greens and One Nation toe-to-toe at about 12 and 11. But then another poll showed One Nation at 21. Now, that's a big difference. If it's up around 21, then it does make it difficult. But you talk about the... I think that CFMEU scandal will have quite an impact. And it'll have an impact because this is not just the first post-Dan Andrews election, which is significant in itself, but the CFMEU thing is it lends itself to easy lines. How much money was lost through corruption, it's all there. That the government is arguing that it's tidied things up, but the problem is who was in charge of this portfolio responsibility when it first happened, and of course that's Jacinta Allen, the Premier. And the most recent poll I saw there had Jess Wilson, the relatively new leader of the Liberal Party, on 39 against 20 as preferred Premier. And that's quite an achievement for a new leader.
Yeah, and I think that was really an anyone but Jacinta Allen vote. Jess Wilson is a very good candidate, but she's very much not defined in the electorate. They don't know much about her. She presents well, and she certainly can create a good story and good narrative over the next 9 months. But I think for the coalition, they don't want to overthink this. The challenge is the CFMEU story is incredibly important, and Nick McKenzie from The Age has done some wonderful work on it. But it is a complicated story to tell, to voters. Whereas like a travel rort story is very simple. Voters understand that, they get that, and it enrages them. But the key word in this CFMU story is corruption. And I think, they just need to keep it at a macro level, which is just keep on emphasising that word without trying to tell this detailed, complicated story and introducing Mick Gatto and his lunches and all that sort of stuff, because that's when I think there's a tendency to lose voters and they can't see the personal relevance or personal consequence to them. And I think, if I was the coalition in Victoria, I would be just saying, if you want to get rid of this corrupt, incompetent government, vote One Liberal. And that hopefully will bring those sort of One Nation voters back, not on merit, but just sort of say, the only way to guarantee to get rid of this government is to vote One Liberal. Because if you vote for another party, there's a danger with preferences and so forth that you could end up with a Labor government. So I think they really need to leverage that and not overthink it. It's not too dissimilar to what Abbott did in 2013, very effectively. And I think, the coalition has got a real opportunity here, but, One Nation is looming large. And we all know, Barry, politicians, they can panic in these situations and try and sort of, out Hanson or leap out at shadows and make themselves less competitive.
No, I see your point. You just do your own thing,
yep,
and hope that works. Because if Jess Wilson fighting her first election has to spend time fighting off One Nation as well, it makes it almost impossible for her. So the approach to just put that to one side, focus on what you're about, that makes a whole lot of sense. You raised the new front bench that Angus Taylor has put together. Most notably, I think he's reward loyalty, certainly loyalty to him, but he did bring in a whole new economic team. And I think that's a critical thing. The kind of dilemma for the coalition nationally is that, well, certainly the Liberal Party in the federal caucus is in the federal party room, is that most of them now are rural and regional members, And the temptation would be to see the issues through the lens of rural and regional Australians when they just have to get back those city seats. But when you look at what has happened, Tim Wilson, his seat is virtually inner city Melbourne. Jane Hume has an office in Richmond, which is inner city Melbourne. And the interesting one, the Tasmanian Senator Claire Chandler, the Shadow Finance Minister now, she's from Hobart. So the economic team is well represented with the city base.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Barry, my little baby boy turned 1 this week, and he's already lived through 3 Liberal leaders. So at this rate, by the time he turns 9, he will cycle through all 27 remaining. But you know, as I tell Thomas every night when we put him to bed, you are now 1 sleep closer to another Liberal leadership spill. And I think that's sort of the heart of the problem is, you know, the great Liberal pastime of looking for a messiah and a scapegoat. And the last week, Susan Ley has been the scapegoat and Angus Taylor is the new messiah. I thought it was a fairly astute reshuffle. He's rewarded his supporters, which you have to do. All sides do it. He's tried not to punish too many Susan Ley people. You know, he's... Because Barry, you know, in this game, in politics, you know, friends come and go, but you accumulate enemies over time. And I can't think of too many political leaders that have ended their careers with less enemies than they started. And you've always got to be conscious that, you know, a very unhappy, disgruntled backbench. He punished Alex Hawke, who's now on the backbench. That was totally expected. And I think you're going to need a telescope to see him. He's going to be so far on the backbench. And Claire Chandler, I thought was very interesting. Her economic credentials were previously unknown to me. She's probably more made a mark of talking about transgender issues, I think, rather than the economy. And I think that's a concern for the Liberal Party because it's fine to have those views that she's got, but you know she's not someone who's been passionate about the economy in the same way that Tim Wilson. Tim Wilson's been talking about the economy in his various different careers for a very long time. In fact, I think he's got a photograph of him and Milton Friedman on his office wall from memory. He loves talking about the economy, which is sets him apart from some of the other predecessors. And look, I think he's got big ideas, and he's always willing to give it a crack. He doesn't assert or just use talking points. He tries to argue the case, which I think is a lost art these days.
And the big ideas will be critical to it because it's one thing to talk about what's wrong with the system, and he's done that. He says that the country needs to cut waste, to boost productivity, to deregulate the economy, we rely too much in terms of jobs on government-supported jobs and so on. But that's outlining the problem, and Angus Taylor does that all the time as well. It's when they come up with the solutions that will matter. You know, your colleague Kosamaris, I think, got it right when he said that you've got to see this situation like you're running a brewery, and you're selling bad beer, and it's not good enough just to change the CEO. The CEO has got to come in and make better beer. Not beer that just sells in, and now I'm paraphrasing, this is my way of expressing it, but the beer has to sell outside of the outback pubs in Queensland. It's got to sell to young people, and it's got to sell in the cities.
You know, one of the coalition's biggest failings last term was to think they could just critique their way to government and then offer a sort of merely sort of, you know, petrol excise relief for 12 months. You know, that's not going to really sort of capture the imagination of voters because they're in the market for some bold policies, bold ideas, you know, something that gives them a bit of hope. Because at the moment, yeah, there's just entrenched pessimism. And, you know, I think for the coalition, you know, they either die on their feet fighting for something, even if it puts a huge bullseye on them, coming under attack from Chalmers and Albanese, or they just die on their knees. You know, at the moment they're just on a, you know, they're on a pathway to total irrelevance if they're not careful. And I think, you know, just hoping that anger in the electorate about the government is not going to be enough for them.
And the other aspect too of the new front benches, they brought the Nationals back right away. That was decided with a fair degree of pragmatism. Angus Taylor is the preferred candidate for the Nationals in terms of the Liberal leadership, and in his own words he says, we just want to get on with it. With that in mind, I just want to read out part of an email from Tim Field. It was a long email, but this is the part that's relevant to what we're talking about. And he said that he'd read your analysis in The Guardian and that Susan Lee is today's scapegoat. I think this is another dimension, though, he says, to all of this, that the Nats will become a major issue for the Libs as they formulate policy. The Nationals are moving to the right to contest One Nation in rural areas. Their policies will overlap and often align with One Nation, and they are not mainstream or acceptable in urban areas. Has he outlined there the dilemma they face?
Yeah, he's spot on. And, the National Party of today is not the National Party of Tim Fischer. And I think, there's a lot of... I think back to 2004, the late Ron Boswell, who campaigned hard against One Nation on the ground. And I think this is the lesson for the coalition of today, is that Howard and Costello, particularly Costello on an economic narrative, really went in hard on One Nation and the threats that they posed to the national economy with their reductive policies. But Boswell on the ground in Queensland was very effective in campaigning against One Nation. And one of those classic sliding door moments, he was so effective with Howard and Costello providing that sort of helicopter sort of air cover that One Nation didn't win a Senate spot that year. And in fact, the coalition won an unprecedented fourth spot out of 6 Senate spots available, which I don't think has ever happened before. And of course, that fourth spot went to a fellow named Barnaby Joyce, who nobody ever expected to win. And of course, the rest is history. Howard then had the numbers to pursue IR, which ended up being a flawed political strategy for re-election. But more relevantly, I think, and Ron Boswell sadly passed away about a month ago, but, I think he would literally turn in his grave if he realised that the guy that he effectively helped get elected in Barnaby Joyce has now joined One Nation. And that's... I think Ron Boswell and Tim Fischer and all those fellows, John Anderson, they campaigned really hard against One Nation, took them front on. And, I saw Jeff Kennett come out recently and suggest that the Victorian Liberal Party cut a deal with One Nation, which seemed out of character for him. He has previously campaigned against One Nation, and I think that's a very flawed strategy.
I just want to go to one other email, in fact, reference to me, in fact, from Belinda Burke. And she said she was disappointed with my comments last week when I was talking about the independent Liberal candidate in Farrer, Michelle Milthorpe. I did describe her as a young mother, a teacher, a netball coach from a small town, and went on to say that given that she didn't win the seat, it could have been a lack of experience and political acumen. And Belinda makes the point that these are not drawbacks. As she sees it. Now, that was open to misinterpretation. I do accept, and I meant to make the point, that all of those things about her being a young mother and a netball coach and so on are assets. It was just the lack of experience. But I do accept now that my comments might have been a bit harsh because given the nature of now what's emerging as the Farrer by-election, it's the difference this time. It won't be just a Liberal candidate that she needs to defeat. It'll be Liberals and Nationals probably going up against each other. One Nation will be in there. So somebody who has fought the campaign before and has gained that experience could come through the middle in a by-election like Farrer. So I take it that I'm being suitably chastised. She went on to say that she hopes Michelle wins because we need diversity and she'll represent her country, her community, rather than the party line. But yeah, you really wouldn't want to try and pick a winner in that electorate.
No, and I think a lot of it's going to come down because it's effectively, potentially a 4-party contest. National Liberals, the Climate 200 candidate who ran last time. There's talk of the state MP for Murray River resigning and running. So, and that's without Labor even entering the contest, which I don't expect they will. So that'll be a potentially 4-party contest or 4-candidate contest. So the order of exclusion of candidates will be critically important, and how disciplined their voters are in following how to vote cards. If they follow them and the preference flows the right way, then, you could very well see one of the independent candidates elected. In fact, I think it's going to be incredibly hard for a Liberal or a National Party candidate to win that seat.
Just before we take a break, I want to mention the ISIS brides issue and their children. It's in the context of how I think it demonstrates how sensitive immigration is going to be as an issue at the next election. But these people, 34 of them, have had 7 years in a refugee camp in Syria. Their husbands had either been killed fighting or in jail. It's a question, I suppose, people are arguing guilt by association. One woman in the who was charged, I think, with being in a prohibited area, only one, and she was convicted, but no prison sentence. I think it was a bond or something. But the issue just seems to be centering on whether the government, what approach is the government taking to these people, and it is a brute of an issue. And I think if there was more space on this issue, it would be very tough on the government. But the point is, to what Anthony Albanese's position is, he's not helping them. I'm not helping them. He said that his mother said, "You made the bed, you lie in it." That's certainly not true of the children, some of them who have been born in that refugee camp. But that's the position. They accept they're Australian citizens. They're entitled to a passport just in the same way that they're entitled to a Medicare card. So if they can find their own way out and get on a plane back to Australia, there's not much the Australian government can do about it. The authorities would then need to keep an eye on things and maybe even charge some of them if they think that they have broken the law. But I think just the enthusiasm that One Nation have taken on this issue for a start, but the Coalition to a lesser extent as well, demonstrates the whole vulnerability, the difficulties for the government at this period over immigration in a post-Bondi atmosphere.
Yeah, I think Mark Riley wrote a great piece this week where he sort of pointed out that ScoMo in 2019 said you can't punish the children for the sins of their parents. The legislation which allows them to come back was actually drafted by the then Minister for Home Affairs, Peter Dutton. And Mark Riley made the point, like, if Albanese doesn't need any more right-wing credibility cover, to bring them back, but he's obviously totally spooked by it. And I think, this is the broader point that you're making as well, Barry, is that, a lot of the current cabinet ministers lived through the 2010 to 2013 Rudd-Gillard government where Rudd basically dismantled the Pacific solution, and either because of that or completely coincidentally, the number of boat arrivals, increased dramatically. And Abbott ran that Stop the Boats campaign, tow them back. And I think, all those guys, Albanese himself, Richard Marles, Penny Wong, Chris Bowen, Tanya Plibersek, they were all sitting there at the time as they got smashed to pieces during that thing. And I think they're so spooked by that. And then you go further back to Tampa, and admittedly, only Tanya Plibersek and Albanese himself were in Parliament at the time. But Tampa was another incident, and which also, it's immigration adjacent, of course. It's not like for like. Yep. But that broader immigration issue, I think, just spooks Labor enormously. And look, some of my friends in the Labor Party say, this is a centre-right issue. It only sort of fragments the right-wing vote, and that's why part of the reason why we're seeing the One Nation vote escalate at the moment is because of immigration. It doesn't impact the centre-left vote. But Albanese's mere actions says to me, they are spooked and they're haunted by that experience, and they just don't want to go there.
Yeah, see, the difference this time, ISIS brides have been brought back to Australia by the Morrison government and previously by the Albanese government, but quietly and without very much fuss. The difference now is the spotlight is right on the issue because it kind of, it fits into the narrative around immigration, to what extent it's going to be exploited as an election. So this time, whatever happens, we're going to know about it. We'll take a break, but I want to pick up an issue after that, an issue that has annoyed me through the summer break. Back in a second. My gripe is over the, and you see it all the time, these protestations, particularly on social media, mainly I think from the right, about this belief that they're losing elections because of the preferential system, that somehow first past the post will be a better system for them, and they're being cheated for as long as this exists. It is a classic case of be careful what you ask for. I mean, it's often quoted that the Albanese government would have won 84 seats anyway at the last election if first past the post had existed. But the figures that I go to, the critical one is what happened in the UK, where they do have first past the post. 650 members in the Commons. Labor got 33.7% of the vote and got 411 of those 650 seats. But the most stark, I think, demonstration of it, and for those who are looking for a Nigel Farage sort of party in Australia, Nigel Farage got 14% of the vote, 5 seats. The Liberal Democrats, 12%, as against Nigel Farage, 14, and they got 72 seats. That's what first past the post can throw up.
Yeah, I share your rant, Barry. I can't say it occupied my Christmas holidays like that, but I sort of think, it's just such a silly argument, because at the end of the day, campaign directors and campaign teams play to the rules that are in place. And I remember very well being in a largish meeting with Linton Crosby after the 1998 federal election, where Beazley won the popular vote, but obviously Howard won more than 75 seats, and so retained government. And some people from the left were sort of saying, well, it should be a popular vote sort of contest. The majority of the people wanted Beazley and Labor. And Linton sort of said, well, the rules are, who wins the most seats. And that's how we campaigned. If the rules were changed to first past the post or popular vote, then we would have campaigned accordingly and changed our entire strategy. And, it sort of reminded me the other day of when Linton Crosby went to the United Kingdom and ran their campaign, I think for David Cameron. He arrived there, and of course, they were very old-fashioned, the Tories, in the way how they campaign, and Linton is, world-class when it comes to campaigning. And their view was all sort of 600-odd seats are winnable. They don't care how safe Labor they are. Very Winston Churchill, we'll fight them on the beaches and we can win these seats. And so accordingly, all their resources would go into all these seats, including safe Labor seats. And one of the biggest things in campaigns is it's about resource allocation and making sure the resources go where they need to go, whether it be human resources, finances, communications, messages, and so forth. And so Linton, who's he's quite brilliant, but diplomacy is not one of his strong skills. Sort of just walked in and said, "No, we're not fucking doing that." We're putting all of our money and resources into the swing seats that are winnable, and we're going to win a majority of seats, which is exactly what they did. So, when people sort of talk about first past the post, it's purely hypothetical. It's like fantasy rugby. It's like it's not real world.
Well, the proposition is so simple, really, that when you get such a spread of choices these days and the fragmentation, that whoever you vote for, the likelihood is that only a third of the nation is going to be behind you on that. So then you get a preference, and if your second preference gets up, the chances are that the majority of Australians may not have had their first choice, but at least they'll be comfortable, they're reasonably comfortable with the result. That's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, and I think all this cheer squad for the right and sort of talking about let's introduce first past the post. The simplest way to win is just to make yourselves relevant to voters. Talk about issues that are relevant to them and offer them something, an alternative on a salient issue where they go, "Yep, you got my vote," or "You've got my second preference." I mean, that's the easiest way to win an election.